Thank you very much for being here today after the deluge that happened a little bit earlier. It is a great pleasure for me to host this event, which marks the first collaboration of the Gennadios Library of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens with the Jewish Museum of Greece in Athens. And before we proceed, I wanted to sort of let you know that on the screen you're looking at the two next lectures that will take place in this auditorium in the next couple of weeks. And although I will invite the director of the Jewish Museum for a formal introduction of our speaker, I wanted to say something about the serendipity that sort of makes certain events happen. I think we met with Nicholas a few years ago in Princeton at the Byzantine Studies Conference, where he was speaking on one of his projects, the sort of collecting Jewish inscriptions in Greece. And I thought it was a wonderful project. And I said, why don't you come and give a talk at the Gennadios? And then, as things happen, we hadn't seen each other for some years, and then a couple of years ago we met in Sofia in Bulgaria at a different Byzantine Congress. So, it is wonderful, as we all know, within the academic world, how you meet people and how connections are formed. And I think we may hear a little bit more about this in regards to the project that we're going to hear about tonight. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Zanette Patinou, the director of the Jewish Museum of Athens, of Greece, to sort of give the formal introduction to our speaker. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good evening. I'm delighted to be standing before you tonight in this first occasion, as Ms. Georgopoulou has already mentioned, of a happy event organized between the Gennadios Library of the American School of Classical Studies and the Jewish Museum of Greece. It is my honor further to introduce the speaker of this evening. You will allow me to read from my piece of paper so I don't make any mistake with his manifold distinctions and achievements. So I will do that in a minute. So I welcome you from my part and on behalf of the Jewish Museum of Greece, and I hope we will all share a very interesting evening together. Now, Nicholas Delange, Professor Emeritus of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at the University of Cambridge, Fellow of the Wolfson College, Cambridge, and Fellow of the British Academy. Nicholas studied classics at Oxford and then wrote a doctoral thesis there on Origen and the Jews. He taught Hebrew and Jewish studies at Cambridge University from 1971 to 2011. For several years now, his principal research interest has been Judaism in the Byzantine Empire. He is the founder and editor of the Bulletin of Judeo-Greek Studies, a biannual listing of research and publications in this area. Nicholas Delange has been long and in many ways associated with the Jewish Museum of Greece. The latest common project, which will be briefly only touched upon tonight, under the title Corpus Inscriptionum Judaicarum Graecae, this JMG research project, that's the Jewish Museum of Greece, aims to document, catalog, and photograph all the published and unpublished Jewish inscriptions in Greek and Hebrew from mainland and island Greece, dating from the 3rd century before Common Era until the 16th century Common Era. Since 2010, Nicholas has been the principal investigator of the research project, which is the main theme of the presentation tonight, under the title Mapping the Jewish Communities of the Byzantine Empire. We will all enjoy, I'm sure.
Good evening. I'd like to begin by thanking the Gennadius Library and the American School of Classical Studies and the Jewish Museum of Greece, in the persons of my good friends Maria Iorgopoulou and Zanet Batinu, for the invitation to come here and address you this evening on this project which I have been working on for 3 years in a concentrated way and for much longer in other ways, a project which is very dear to my heart and which is coming to its end now, and it's extremely important for me and for all the participants in the project to make its work known, to explain the existence of our website and how it works and what it can do, and to encourage you to tell your friends about it, and particularly to give me some feedback if you think there's anything I could improve in the few remaining weeks. This project aims for the first time to make real maps of the Jewish communities of the Byzantine Empire. I'll explain later what I mean by real maps. We plan to enable everybody, specialists, general scholars, and indeed the public at large, to generate online maps of the Jewish presence in the Byzantine Empire according to their own specifications. And we're using GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems, to do it. I'll explain about that as well later. This project is funded by the European Research Council, and it aims to fill a gap in 2 fields, in Byzantine history and Jewish history. Additionally, the application of this relatively new technology to the study of a historical subject will furnish a model that can be followed in other historical projects. This, incidentally, is taken from the website about the project, and you can find, those of you who use computers can find the URL on the handout, and I'll show it again right at the end. That explains all about the project and what it's doing. That's me. And at the beginning of the project, I had fewer grey hairs, but it wasn't that long ago. The project is based in Cambridge, and the core team consists of myself as principal investigator, Alexander Panayotov, one of our 2 postdoctoral researchers, shown here, I think, probably in Mount Athos, and Alex is a historian and epigrapher with considerable experience of late antique Judaism in East Europe, particularly around Greece. And the 3rd member of our Cambridge team, Gethin Rees, is somebody with a lot of experience of using GIS technology in the service of history of religions. We also have the help of researchers and field workers based in Greece, Turkey, and Italy. Here's, by the way, this is the Cambridge team recently in Constantinople. We were very fortunate to be received in audience and to receive the blessing of His All Holiness, the Ecumenical Patriarch, for our work. And we were able to explain to him what we were trying to do, and I believe he expressed some interest. Anastasia Ludaru, who is present tonight, is our researcher and field worker based in Athens. And Anastasia works in the Jewish Museum of Greece, and she's currently engaged in the project which was mentioned earlier, the Corpus Inscriptionum Judaicarum Graeciae, cataloguing all the Jewish inscriptions in Greece down to the end of the Middle Ages. She's also, in her spare time, busy writing, spare time in inverted commas, writing her doctoral dissertation on the Jewish presence in Greece in the ancient and late antique periods down to the time of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. In Turkey, our researcher and field worker is Inci Türkoğlu, who is also writing a doctoral dissertation on the city of Chalcedon, and she works as a tour guide specializing in Jewish sites in Turkey. So she's been particularly helpful. I recently did a little tour of Western Asia Minor with Inci, and she was wonderfully well connected when it came to talking to museum directors and so on. And the third member of our little overseas team is Aleida Paudice, who is based in Italy and Germany, and she's been very particularly helpful in our work within the Venetian State Archives, Archivio di Stato di Venezia, where she did a lot of her doctoral research. She did a doctorate with me in Cambridge on one of the leading Jewish scholars in early 16th century Crete. Now, you could ask, why should one study Byzantine Jewish history? There are two main reasons I can think of. Firstly, it provides a relatively compact and limited body of data to work on a historical project like this. But secondly, it happens to be an unjustly neglected subject. Although within historical studies generally, minority history has become a major concern, in Byzantine studies, research and publication still focus on the Orthodox Christian majority. No monograph on the Jewish minority has ever been written by a Byzantinist. And most general Byzantine histories still largely ignore the Jews. A few works on Byzantine history do mention Jews in passing, but the treatment is superficial and relies on a very small range of sources. Jewish historians, I mean historians of the Jews, for their part, have almost totally ignored Byzantine Jewish history. I must say, I'm not concerned here with the term Byzantine as it's used by archaeologists and late antique historians in Israel. They have their own usage, and to denote a period that ends in the early 7th century with the Arab conquest, and actually that's more or less the time when my project begins. So leaving that aside, books of Jewish history simply ignore the Byzantine experience. Only 4 scholars have written substantial works in English in this area. They're on the screen. Top left is Joshua Starr, who published in Athens in 1939 the first really important book on this subject, about the Jews in the Byzantine Empire from the period of Justinian until the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Secondly, next to him, Tzvi Ankori, whose book Karaites in Byzantium, published in, I think, 1959, is a monumental study of the Karaite minority in the empire. And then underneath him, bottom right, is David Jacobi, Professor Emeritus in Jerusalem, who's written extensively on Jewish history, particularly trade in Byzantium and in the Mediterranean more generally. And the other person on bottom left, Stephen Bowman of the University of Cincinnati, who took up the challenge of the work of Joshua Starr and wrote about the Jews of Byzantium after the 1204 crusade and up to the fall of Constantinople, so roughly the Paleologan period. These, as I say, are the only people who've ever written substantial works in English on this subject. The main aim of my project is to attempt to remedy this deficiency by providing a solidly based infrastructure which will enable the Jewish minority to be studied in its own right, as well as to be integrated within wider Byzantine or Jewish history. And this aim will be achieved in 3 ways. First of all, assembling all the firm data relating to the presence of Jewish communities in the empire. Secondly, using the data to map the communities and their history. 3, to use cutting-edge technology to generate, visualize, and interpret the resulting maps. A further important aim is to explore how the information technology element of the project can be extrapolated and applied as a tool in other historical projects. So it's intended as a contribution to a fast-growing discipline that's come to be known as digital humanities. There are very important questions concerning the definition of the information being gathered, the way that it's analyzed and presented, and the possible uses that it can be put to by historians and others. The relatively unexplored nature of the subject means that it's impossible to predict all the uses to which historians and other researchers will wish to put the data. Some uses are fairly obvious. For example, basic questions about the presence of Jews in a particular place at a given time, their occupations, or their economic activities. But others are harder to predict. It's possible that end users of our maps may be interested in the involvement of women in specific activities, in questions of wealth and poverty, or cultural matters such as the level of education, the availability of specific written texts, or the travels of a particular manuscript or a particular scribe. No doubt, in the future, new concerns which will develop which we can't even guess at. So we have tried to include all the suitable data without filtering them in any way. There are some methodological questions that faced us right at the start. One is, who is a Jew? I mean, how do you define what counts as information about Jews? Well, actually, this isn't as hard as it might seem, for two reasons. First of all, the Byzantine state recognized a specific Jewish identity, as the Jewish communal authorities themselves did, so they all agreed about who was a Jew. There are some small grey areas, such as different religious sects. I mentioned the Karaites earlier, and also possible converts to or from Judaism. We decided to include everything that related to these people. Secondly, the use of Hebrew language is a marker of Jewish identity. The language was only used by Jews, and most Jewish documents, including tombstones, are couched in it. In the case of the earlier period, which we're not concerned with, late antiquity and the very earliest Byzantine period, the Jewish inscriptions were in Greek. And people have noted ambiguities. People have said, well, this inscription looks Jewish, but it might actually be Christian or pagan. This problem does not arise in the Middle Ages because the Hebrew language, as I've said, is only used by Jews. We do have documents drawn up in Latin or Greek, such as wills from Venetian Crete, but they always begin by saying so-and-so the Jew, and so we know that they're about Jews. The project is defined temporally and spatially, that is in time and in space. We propose to begin in the middle of the 7th century, that is after the loss of the eastern provinces, notably Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, with their very large Jewish populations, to the Arab invasions. It would have been unnecessarily complicated to include those regions for a short earlier period. Actually, in practice, we have very little data, very few data for the period 650 to 1000. So the precise start date within this period is rather arbitrary, and could be adjusted. We have, for example, as you may see, if you look at our website, we have some earlier dates that appear. That's because of uncertainty about the precise date of certain data. Now, the traditional end date for everything to do with Byzantium is 1453, which is the date of the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks. But in fact, that's not a very practical date for us for a couple of reasons. One is the Turkish conquest happened at different dates outside Constantinople. And secondly, as far as the Jews were concerned, that's not a meaningful sort of date. The more meaningful date is 1492, actually, when huge numbers of Jews from Spain and Portugal began to arrive in this part of the world, following the conclusion of the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. So we finish really at the end of the 15th century. Geographically, spatially, the choices are more complex because the frontiers of the Byzantine Empire were constantly changing. And here they are in the 9th century, then the 11th century, the 12th century, 13th century. So where should our map begin and end? For the purposes of our project, the core areas of, sorry, let me go back if I can. The core areas of Asia Minor, particularly Western Asia Minor, the southern Balkans, and the adjacent islands, including Crete and Cyprus. are included for the whole of the period, regardless who was the ruling power at any particular time. For example, in Crete, for most of the time that we have data, it's the Venetians. But we still consider it to be part of the Byzantine Empire for the purposes of the map. It's a bit more complicated when we come to places like South Italy, which were only Byzantine for a relatively short period. Where do we get the data from? Well, we use different types of sources. First of all, literary sources. These could be Jewish writings in Hebrew, which mention places within the Byzantine Empire. Christian writings in Greek, which refer to Jews. We have documents, that is, for example, monastic records or other kinds of letters, wills, and so on. Colophons in manuscripts, I'll come back to those. And archaeological discoveries, including, very importantly, inscriptions. Now, those of you who are involved with Byzantine history know that there are certain types of material that are commonly used by Byzantine historians, and most of these are lacking when we look at the Jewish minority. We have no Byzantine Jewish archives preserved. We have no Jewish coins or seals, or possibly one or two seals, but insignificant. They don't contain any information about date or place. Leaving aside the earliest period, which I said is outside the scope of the project, there are no excavated synagogues or other Jewish buildings, and there is no Jewish iconography. There's almost nothing in the way of ritual objects, charms and amulets, jewelry or domestic items with a demonstrably Jewish origin. These gaps in the evidence are really serious problems for research, which we try to address in this project by focusing on the totality of the extant evidence, and particularly on data that can be spatially and temporally referenced. Literary sources, both Christian and Jewish, are rich in information about Byzantine Jews, but not all of it's reliable, and much of it is tantalizingly hard to pin down in terms of place and time. There are two Jewish documents which are particularly important for us. In fact, these are the only sources which are regularly cited in mentions of the Jewish presence in the Byzantine Empire. Both of them are Hebrew texts written by Jews. One is a family chronicle compiled in the mid-11th century in southern Italy by Achimaatz of the town of Oria, and extending back some 200 years. It's shed considerable light on Jewish life in Byzantine South Italy. And the other one is the travelogue of Benjamin of Tudela, a Spanish Jew who passed through the Byzantine lands in the mid-12th century, and he listed the names of the leaders of each Jewish community he encountered, and he gave the size of the community, sometimes adding some further information about occupations and so forth. This is a very important document, and here we've mapped the places he visited in the empire. He came, as you'll see, from southern Italy, crossed to Corfu and western Greece, and then crossed Greece, went up round through Thrace and down the islands off the coast of Asia Minor. And finally to Cyprus, where he left the empire. In the category of documentary materials, several volumes of notarial documents from Venetian Crete have been published, and each of these contains documents concerning Jews, all carefully dated and localized in such and such a place, such and such a date, and that's really the kind of data we need. A good deal of information about individuals and about social and economic history can also be gleaned from legal documents, such as, for example, rabbinic responsa, replies to questions, and local bylaws of the Jewish communities. Takanot, we have the takanot, or bylaws of the Jewish community of Candia, Heraklion, which are a wonderful source of detailed information, and the laws are all dated. Some Jewish documents from Byzantium have been found in the Cairo Geniza, which is the most important find of Jewish manuscripts, discovered in the 1890s and still not fully inventoried. I've published a catalogue of these in 1992, but others have been turning up since. There are quite a few of them. Among the written materials recovered from the Cairo Geniza, we have some personal or family documents, such as deeds of marriage or divorce, wills or genealogies, which relate to Byzantine Jews. This happens to be a record of a marriage that took place in 1022 in Mastaura, a small town in the valley of the River Meander in Western Asia Minor. And it's particularly interesting. It has a date, and it has a place, so it's just the right sort of data for us. It mentions all the objects which the bride brought to the wedding. The purpose of that is that in the case of divorce, she should be able to recover them and take them with her. And so it gives us a wonderful idea of what the trousseau of a Jewish bride was like in the 11th century. But it also happens to record, for the first and only time, the presence of Jews in the town of Mastara. Archaeological excavation has so far yielded very little in the way of concrete evidence of Jewish settlement, but advances in medieval archaeology are being made all the time, and the topography of Byzantine towns is becoming much clearer, making it possible, in some cases, to trace the location of the Jewish quarter, the synagogues, and the necropolis, so as we can make sure that we take account of the latest discoveries. One of the things we did was we walked around the old town of Constantinople with a GPS. That's different from a GIS. GPS is, you know, the thing that records the coordinates of where you happen to be, tracing the lines of the walls and various important landmarks so that we could, looking at written documents, locate the Jewish communities at different times. And this is the result. The Chalcopatia is the very earliest place that we have some record, although there was a Jewish settlement in Perama near the Galata Bridge later, and then across the Golden Horn in Pera, and finally in the south of the peninsula near the Theodosian port in Vlaanga. Inscriptions are a particularly important source because their data generally relate to a known locality. They hardly ever move very far, and they're often dated. This is an inscription from Negroponte, Chalkiva, relating to some public building, probably. It's interesting because if you can read Hebrew, it has a date in the year 1326. And it mentions, in the third line from the bottom, the town, Egripon. That's the Ottoman name of Negroponte is Egribos, very similar. And so that confirms that it is a local inscription and wasn't brought there at some point. Unfortunately, apart from Italy, which has quite a few inscriptions, there are not very many dated Byzantine Jewish inscriptions have been found. Anastasia and I have been traveling around Greece, desperately looking for these inscriptions, but despite traveling a lot, we haven't managed to find very many. We have discovered a few which were unpublished. So we've tried to incorporate unpublished materials as much as we can in the project. And this search for inscriptions is contributing to the work of the corpus which we've already mentioned that the Jewish Museum is producing, and also a corpus which I'm hoping to publish of medieval Hebrew inscriptions from all over the Byzantine Empire. Now, one of the potentially richest sources, the only artifacts that really survive in large quantities from Byzantine Jewry, are manuscripts. No use has been made, really, or very little use by historians of these manuscripts. It's been estimated recently by specialists in Hebrew manuscripts that about 10% of all medieval Hebrew manuscripts are Byzantine in origin. Now, when you consider that there could be as many as 10,000 medieval Hebrew manuscripts altogether, that means that there are that's not right, sorry. There are about 100,000 Hebrew manuscripts altogether, including fragments, and therefore there could be as many as 10,000 Byzantine Hebrew manuscripts. Now, some, not all of these, have colophons, that is, texts added at the end by the scribe, in which the scribe says where and when he wrote the manuscript. He said, I finished this manuscript in the city of Patras in such and such a date. Sometimes they add details. They say, I'm sorry that the writing got very bad at the end because I ruined my eyesight writing this thing, or one woman wrote, I'm sorry that it's a little bit unclear at one point because I was breastfeeding while I was writing and it was extremely inconvenient. But the most important thing is that they tell us where they were working, and sometimes we can see the same scribe moving from place to place, or we can see a number of scribes working in the same place. There are no Jewish scriptoria such as you get in Christian monasteries. On the whole, scribes write for themselves and very often for their own use because of their interest in medicine, natural science, or other topics. Most of these colophons begin to get numerous at the beginning of the 14th century, but there are some earlier examples going back to the 12th century. And also, apart from colophons, you get annotations in manuscripts where people say, for example, that they bought or sold a manuscript. This is a very beautiful biblical manuscript now in Cambridge, copied actually in Byzantium. We don't know the date, but it was subsequently bought by somebody in Candia and then taken to Negroponte and dedicated in the synagogue there as a gift. And that's a little bit outside our period, but I put it here as an example of the sort of annotations that you get that are of interest because they mention dates and places. The State Archives of Venice are also a very rich source of published and particularly unpublished data on Jews in Crete and to a lesser extent other places. Actually, I was hoping at one time we would go into the archives and just record all the data that are there about the Jews in Crete particularly, but this was such an enormous task, and the conditions of working are so restricted because they only give you a few envelopes at a time, and so if you order your 3 envelopes and there's nothing in them, you just have to go home and come back the next day and start again. We gave up, but we have included some unpublished material. Now, I'd like to say something about GIS, without which we couldn't make our maps. The collected data are built, they're made into a database, and then they're built into a GIS. What is GIS? GIS can be defined as a computer-based technology for retrieving, storing, and organizing data based on their location on a map. In recent years, the use of Internet GIS, or web maps, has allowed the general public to access large volumes of spatial data easily through websites like Google Maps, which many of you may be familiar with. Google Maps are a very good illustration of the use of GIS. There are 2 major benefits from using a GIS approach to study Jewish communities living in the Byzantine Empire. First, the approach provides a new way to visualize data and to make fresh interpretations. GIS allows spatial and historical data to be interpreted in ways that couldn't be possible using conventional mapping techniques. Secondly, GIS can make information on Jewish communities accessible via the World Wide Web. This, apart from anything else, apart from the access it gives you to enormous audiences, it facilitates updating. And in the future, it will enable others to integrate our project GIS with other databases. Traditional maps present a lot of disadvantages. Firstly, they're often inaccurate and subjective. They're compiled by historians who just want to make a point, who often have very little sense of where places really are. We were looking at this earlier. I was looking at this with Anastasia. The map on the bottom left has put Thebes, where I think where Athens is. It's rather hard to tell because it's such a large blob that you couldn't actually identify it anyway. And in general, these maps are static. That means they display different kinds of data at all times, making it difficult to distinguish between different features or to evaluate their relevance. They just basically show where places are. Occasionally they have great big arrows, and these are extremely vague and subjective and tell you nothing very much. Traditional forms of publication are not particularly well suited to the effective distribution of spatial data, either because maps are physically cumbersome and they're hard to reproduce and distribute. A key feature of GIS is that it allows historical information to be depicted spatially with greater clarity than is possible with traditional maps. This is our map, and it is accurate and reliable, supposedly. It's based on satellite imagery, so the natural features should be more or less where they're supposed to be. And users are made aware of the sources of information that have been used to make it, so you can actually track down where this information comes from. The ability of GIS to separate data into different layers allows the various parts of a data set to be distinguished from one another, so that those that are of relevance to the question in hand can be examined separately and interpreted in reference to each other. So it's like a database where you can select a part of the database and focus on it, except that you can do it spatially, visualize it spatially on the map. Thirdly, the use of a web map enables our research to be published over the web, incorporating a search mechanism that anybody can use. Very similar to Google Maps, actually, as you'll see. This can then be hosted for many years after the project is finished and served to clients, users, when required. Digital functionality, such as search mechanisms, allows web mapping interfaces to disseminate bespoke data to large numbers of users efficiently. Our web map is dynamic, therefore not static, and it's interactive. That means that users will be able to create their own tailor-made maps and then navigate around them or modify them according to their interests. Maps can also be saved and downloaded. Our GIS stores two types of information: features, which have a specific location, and attributes, which are data attached to these locations. These are depicted on a background of satellite imagery. Attributes include the place, the date, the size of the local Jewish population, the religious sect, the trade or occupation, the type of residence, for example, a Jewish quarter, and names. These will be searchable and accessible by clicking on map symbols with the mouse. I'll hope to have time at the end to demonstrate how this works. Particular attention has been paid to the representation of uncertain data, because we don't want to give the impression that there is greater certainty than there is. And when you're dealing with the Middle Ages, you don't have the certainty that you have when you're dealing with contemporary conditions. Sometimes a place name is ambiguous. Sometimes the precise year where an event occurred isn't known. It was difficult to find ways to show this on the map, and we've worked very hard to do it in a reasonable way that doesn't get become too much of an obstacle in the use of the maps. I'll give you an example. A chrysobull, an edict of the Emperor Constantine X Ducas in the 11th century, relates to a change in the status of 15 Jewish families on the island of Chios. Jewish families were assigned to the monastery of Ner Moni, giving the monastery the right to collect taxes from these Jews. Well, that's very interesting. It's localized. It belongs to Chios. And it's dated. It's dated in the latter part of the reign of Constantine X. And that narrows it down to a 5-year period from 1062 to 1067. This period is short enough for us to consider the event as a dated event, and so it is suitable for inclusion in the database. But it would be misleading for us to mention it under each one of the 6 years in question, because of course it didn't happen in all of those 6 years. It only happened in one of them, and our problem is that we don't know which one. What we see here in this little screenshot is that I've taken the 5 years, actually, in this case, for a particular reason which is irrelevant. And you can see that in each of those years, there is the presence of a little blue blob, a square, and that shows that it's a possible date for this event, but it's also beneath a line which marks the top of the squares in the little row on the right above the map, and that shows that it's uncertain data. And when it appears on the map, it appears as relatively weak shading for the circle that represents Chios, and that shows you, if you're really interested, that there is an uncertainty. So it means that someone who's just browsing and isn't too concerned with the details will see that something happened at that time in Chios. But someone who's really interested in getting it right for some purpose will be able to explore more deeply, and they can also follow it up in the literature, as I'll show you later. A common form of uncertainty is spatial uncertainty, and that occurs often when the same name applies to various places. For example, a letter found in the Cairo Geniza is addressed to the Jewish community of Marathia. Now, it happens that more than 7 Marathias are known, 7 of them on the Greek mainland. And we have no way of telling from the letter itself which one is the one in question. So what do? Do we just throw this piece of evidence away? Well, I wanted to use it, but I didn't want to give the impression that we know where Marathia is. And so we use these red dots to show that there is a spatial uncertainty. And so someone who's being really careful will realize that these are not 7 different references to Jews at a particular date, but they are 7 possible places where the event in question occurred. What all of this means in a nutshell, and using human language, is that end users, whether they're specialist scholars, students, or members of the public, will be able to access reliable information about the Jewish presence in Byzantium and to visualize this in the form of maps constructed to their own specifications. This represents a completely new approach to the presentation of the subject, and one which has endless applications in the presentation of other historical topics too. I'd like to use the time that I've got left to introduce you to the maps themselves. And for this purpose, I'm going to ask Anastasia to help me, because she's helped me in everything else I've done, and she understands how these computers operate. So
The first one, right?
I want to, yes, get rid of that one. When you, at the moment, we're not quite ready to show this to the general public, so you're having a sneak preview of what it's going to look like. And this is what you will encounter. It's not going to look quite as cluttered as this. We're working on improving the appearance, and we're working on making it generally operate much better. But at the heart of it is a map. And you can see that the map has lots of places marked on it, and these are places where there were Jewish communities in the Middle Ages. So that's the map, and it looks a bit like Google Maps. You've got the same sort of bars on the tools on the top left, which will allow you to navigate around the map and to zoom in and out. But there are also other things as well. There's a time bar at the top. This is the whole period of the project here, from about 650 to about 1500. And the data above the line are certain data, and you can see that quite a lot of the data are below the line and therefore uncertain. And we have shown at the right a key allowing you to remember which are the spatially and which are the temporally uncertain data. Actually, I'm going to try and make this, before it goes live, I'm going to try and make that a little bit less prominent so we have more room to display the map. Now, what's particularly useful, there are 2 ways. There are 2 tabs, which are one called location and one called table. We're on location. If we go to table, then we get the actual database, or we get a summary of the data arranged in columns on the principles that I showed you earlier. This is an example, not using all the fields. And you'll see that apart from the years in question and the place, we have some information about the spatial and temporal uncertainty. In this case, false means that there is no uncertainty, and true means that there is uncertainty. It's perhaps a bit confusing. And then we have information about, for example, occupations. You can see there agriculture, a cantor, that's a synagogue cantor. And then in the last column, we've got the actual sources, published or unpublished, on which, from which the information comes. Occasionally, the sources are unpublished, in which case you just get a reference to the source, a class mark of a manuscript, or an inventory number of an inscription, for example. But usually, you've got published sources, so you can follow them up, and there'll be a key to explain what these bibliographical abbreviations stand stand for. Now, how do you manipulate your way around? Can we go more to the left? We've got these little panels, of which perhaps the most important are toponym and when. Toponym, as you know, this is the one country where I don't have to explain what a toponym is, I hope, is a place name. And the place names are listed, so you browse them, you can't just invent them. We do have a list of alternative names, so that, for example, Chalkida is not shown, or Chalkis is not shown on this list. We would have Negroponte, and there's a separate panel which allows you to discover, if you've got a source that mentions Chalkis, what it's going to be called here. There's Negroponte, 78. Should we click on it and see what happens? We'll get 78 places, 78 occurrences of events connected with Jews in Negroponte at different times. Yeah, well, yes, then we'll see where it is on the map in case we're not quite sure. There it is. So let's go back to the toponym panel. And the other panel underneath it is we call when. That's the one with the dates. And we can choose the dates that we are interested in. So the little bar at the bottom of that, and we can move it around. We can change the starting date, for example. Yeah, there we can say 1,000, for example, there. And we can change the other one to, let's say, 1,100. And then we'll just get the 11th century references. We'll give it a moment to adjust. I hope it will. I don't seem to be wanting to do it. Anyway, it will, I presume. There it is. Sorry, there was the 11th century. We lost it. Oh, you're sorry, because that's Negroponte and we haven't got anything from the 11th century. So because the toponyms are at the top, the choice of toponym determines what we see in the when panel. However, we can move them around. Can you, if you seize the bar at the top of toponym and put it underneath the one, the blue bar at the top, yes, and reverse them. Now we see it the other way around. If we unclick Negroponte, well, we haven't got it, have we? We've got all the places. Sorry, what we have there, all the places where we have 11th century data relating to Jews. Because you might be more interested in the date than in the place, obviously.
I can go back and then do. You want to put the content back, right?
Well, no, it was only an example. We can have, what have we got here? Let's have a look, because I don't want to go on forever and ever, and I'm sure you have some questions. Let's look at the next, that one. This is the same site. Here we have selected for you the places which refer in residence to Jewish quarters, because it's quite interesting to know, on the whole in the Byzantine Empire, there were Jewish quarters in many towns, and they're mentioned in sources, but Jews didn't have to live in them, except in a few cases, particularly under Venetian rule in Crete. The ghetto, which started in Venice, was imposed in Crete, as Maria has written about this very importantly. So here we list all the places, what's happened, where, these are all the places where we have a reference to a Jewish quarter. So this is an example of the kind of historical research that you can do very easily using these maps. You could also extend it to have a Jewish street, a Jewish gate, and so forth. If we go to the next, that one, we've selected all the references of Jews connected with silk, with the production and production of and trade in silk. It's sometimes thought that Jews were very prominent in the silk trade because of a number of sources which mention them. Actually, what we see here is that the evidence has been somewhat exaggerated, and there isn't that much evidence of involvement of Jews in the production and trade in silk. And in fact, some of the references could well be nothing to do with silk, because there's been a tendency, because of this idea that Jews were involved with silk. For example, we found we saw an inscription of a tombstone of a Jewish dyer in Corinth, someone whose trade was dyeing, And it's generally been assumed that he dyed silk, but actually there's nothing in his tombstone to say that he dyed silk. He could have dyed wool. Why do we assume that he dyed silk? Only because we think, Jew, therefore he must have been dyeing silk. Well, I could go on until the cows come home, partly because it's my passion at the moment, and partly because it's also new and exciting, and I don't often have a captive audience like this, but I mustn't abuse my privilege. So let me stop there.
Some other occupations.
Yes, if people have individual questions, we can look at them, but I think I'd like to turn it over to you now and see if you have any responses, and particularly helpful criticisms. Thank you.
The only thing is that we are being videotaped, so if there is a question, just wait for the microphone.
Thank you, that was very interesting. I was wondering if you could tell me, with your website, is there a way for people who are maybe traveling or researching in Greece, should they find any inscriptions or information, to contact you to have it be added to the database? And my second question, is there a way also to search for the kind of evidence, whether it's a manuscript or an inscription, within the database? Thank you.
Thank you. Two very good questions. The first one is, well, I'm writing, if you're talking about inscriptions, I'm compiling the corpus, which will be published, corpus of Hebrew inscriptions, including unpublished inscriptions, and I would like to know, definitely would like to know, or Anastasia would like to know for the corpus she's doing for the museum, because there's still time to include those, at least over the next few months. If a lot of material comes to light, I suppose there could be an appendix or something like that. Most of the inscriptions actually are not dated, but if we had dated material, I suppose at some future time it would be possible to have a further project to update this. But the way that these grants work, on the 31st of March, the bank account will be frozen and we won't be in a position to do anything else after that time. Now, the second question that you asked is one we actually discussed this morning. We haven't made provision at the moment so far for you to do this, but I think actually it would be a good idea if we would allow you to search for all the inscriptions or all the manuscripts. And I'm going to, when I go back, I'm going to talk to my team to see whether in the time that we've got, we can make that available as well. Do you think that it would be useful?
Yes, I think for some researchers it probably would be.
Right.
I'm wondering whether you could tell us a few historical details. How these people were found here, when did they mostly arrive, how did they regain their language after writing in Greek, writing in Hebrew, and which percentage, roughly, of the total population of the Byzantine state were they?
Well, I can try to answer those questions, but it's hard to answer them in relation to the project. And the reason for that is that, as I said, we have based the maps entirely on the actual data. And the questions that you've asked are questions which people have tried to answer on many occasions, but always in the absence of data. So in a way, we're trying to revolutionize the approach to writing the history of this minority by trying to say, well, in certain cases, we don't know. For example, I have asked a number of specialists in Byzantine population if they can estimate the proportion or percentage of Jews in the Byzantine population. And the answers I got were quite contradictory. One person, very eminent Byzantine historian, said to me, I think they were quite insignificant, a really insignificant number. There may have been small local concentrations, but globally they were not really significant. Another person said to me, oh, well, I think in any city, you know, if you went into a city, you would certainly be aware of the presence of Jews. They would have been quite noticeable, and they would have been quite numerous, and they would have looked, perhaps dressed differently, and perhaps lived in a certain street or a certain group of streets. So the answers I got were quite contradictory. What the maps will allow you to do is to see where the data is particularly are particularly rich, and that is the case, for example, in Candia, where we have vast numbers of documents in the Venetian archives and in the Jewish archives, not to mention some dated inscriptions and so on. So we have a lot of information, and it's clear that in the city of Candia, modern Heraklion, the presence of the Jews was really quite a visible part of the urban landscape. They occupied a quarter quite near the sea, near where the present Historical Museum of Crete is. And anybody would have known that. It was the Zudeka, the Jewish quarter was quite a prominent thing. But there were other places, and the same would be true in Constantinople, for example. But there are lots of other places where this isn't the case. And you have to say, then you have to ask yourself questions like, is that because of the documents? In the case of Crete, the Venetian ruling power could see that the island was going to be captured by the Ottomans at some point in the future. And they set to work, the archivists set to work, boxing up the archives and sending them back on boats to Venice, and then they opened a building in Venice full of them. So we actually have virtually the entire, I think, is it the entire archive?
We have 3/5 because two of the boats
Two of the boats sank, but we have this enormous wealth of day-to-day administration. You know, a delegation of Jews went to the governor, and they said, we've got a problem with the taxes, they're too high, could you make an exception? And he records it in his book, and it's all there with their signatures, and including documents in Hebrew, and it's amazing. But there are many other places where we have no information at all. Negroponte, which was also, to some extent, under Venetian control, gives us much less information, because we don't have that same resource. So the answer to your question, I would love to give you a straightforward answer and say, well, I can say certain things. There were Jews in Greece before there were Christians, obviously, because Paul preached in the synagogues. So the presence of Jews is very old. It's well attested in the Greco-Roman period, particularly in the time in late antiquity, where we have really quite plentiful. Not so much data, but testimony to the existence of Jewish communities in many parts of Greece. But if we ask ourselves the question, well, what happened after that? Did the Jews all stay in the same place? Were the Jews that we read about in the sources the same people, or were they immigrants? Or when the Byzantine emperors, as they occasionally did, decreed that all the Jews had to become Christians, does that mean that temporarily there were no more Jews for a bit and then they came back? We don't know the answers to those questions. We really don't. And what I'm trying to do with these maps is to encourage people to have the confidence to say, I don't know the answer to that question because the data simply don't exist. Probably not the sort of answer you wanted, but that's what we're trying to do, to bring some clarity and some reliability into the discussions of the evidence. We have, incidentally, had to jettison all the data that didn't have both a place and a date. We've deliberately limited ourselves to those data. So actually, there are other things that are known, but we don't know where they refer to or when. So I suppose you could enlarge it somewhat, but that is the way that has led to very vague and speculative comments being made by historians, which I don't think can really be supported, because they're subjective.
Thank you for that illuminating answer. I'd like to follow up on that question by asking if there's a way to save the data. So if you are searching, let's say you're interested in changing demography of Jewish populations, which is something you could do here and would go to the heart of answering that question, would be an interesting research project. As you go through asking questions period by period, place by place, can you save the data or do you have to copy it down by
you know, I haven't actually, because I haven't actually tried saving yet. We're still doing the review of how it works to see what we need to change. So you can save a map and download it, as I said, and print it and so on. But I haven't checked to see what happens if you do it through the other table. I think you can. I think you can get the table and save that, and then you've got all the references, and you can also print out the bibliographical key so that you can actually do all the research. And I'll make sure that if we haven't done it already, that it does happen. Thank you. That's a very good point.
Hello. Is it possible to depict relations between communities, relations we know of, or networks that we are aware of on the map in order to visualize them?
Yes. We did start by thinking that we could do that. In fact, originally I wanted to have a lot of extra data. At the moment, the maps are physical maps. I thought originally that we could show the trade routes, we could show the travels of individuals or of manuscripts, that we could show connections. It turned out that technically, at least within the 3-year project that we were financed for, we just couldn't do that. Partly because of the relative strength of the data. That is, it would end up being stronger in some places and weaker in others, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have something fairly consistent. For example, once you start showing trade routes, if you want a line joining two communities, you've got to know where it goes. Well, you don't always know because there are mountains in the way or seas, and you don't always know where the line should go. And I'm not that keen on just drawing lines out of my head, as I hope I've explained. And then it also got much, much too complicated, because you might know that what you're interested in, but if we try to anticipate all the connections that people might be interested in, it would get out of hand. So what you have at the moment is, if in the data you have something like a Jew from Patras who dies and is buried in Negroponte, that you could see mentioned. Whether we are in a position now to search and locate that under both places, I'm not sure, but I'm going to check when we go back, because I think that is an interesting. It's one of the things we really want to do, because certain communities are very closely connected. I've mentioned Candia and Negroponte, for example. They're very closely connected. There was a lot of toing and froing into a marriage of people from the different communities. It would be nice to be able to show that. But I don't think the way we're going at the moment we can do it with lines on the map, unfortunately. I think you would have to do the footwork yourself. You see, I thought that these maps could be used by people at a very general level. Supposing, let's say, a Jewish family from Brooklyn who are going on holiday in Istanbul, and they thought it would be rather nice to know where the Jews used to live in Istanbul at different times in the past. I wanted them to be able to see, and we will have a plan of Constantinople. I didn't want to confuse them with science so that they felt, well, this is just beyond me. This is too scientific. I can't use this site. At the same time, I hope that we've got all the data that will allow you to make the connections, but you'd have to follow it up in the literature. That's Candia. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. What about the archaeological material? Your database is established on documents, manuscripts, and inscriptions. What about the archaeological material that is already published? And we have a lot of finds, for instance, in Kyklades Island, with oil lamps from Palestinian origin and a lot of other sites that includes such material. It was in purpose that you exclude this archaeological evidence from your research, or not?
No, I mentioned archaeological evidence, but I also mentioned the fact that we have a great shortage for the centuries in question. And I particularly mentioned inscriptions because of all the archaeological discoveries, the inscriptions are the ones which are most often dated. But if you've got, let's say, a layer, we were looking at an oil lamp today, which was found in the Agora here, and it was found in a certain layer of, I think, ash, so which can be roughly dated. It turns out it's much too early for our project. And I think that probably Anastasia may correct me, but that's mostly the case, that most of the discoveries of that sort are too early. They belong to the period of late antiquity. But even if we found one in, let's say, the 11th century, the time span that's involved is usually so big that it makes it difficult. If it says, for example, 11th century, question mark, we can't really integrate it in a database like this. It's just too inaccurate. But if we have things that are precisely dated, let's say that it's found in conjunction with something that can be really dated, or the inscriptions which actually have dates on them, then we certainly use them. And we've got some data. So I'm not excluding archaeological discoveries, but there's incredibly little has been excavated in relation to the Jewish minority in Byzantium after the Arab conquests.
You may have already made this clear, but I don't hear very well, so forgive me if you have. But when you answer, please be next to the microphone so that I can hear now. Do you integrate data from or about all localities that belong to the empire at one time or another for the whole time range, that is from 650 to 1492? For instance, for about, I don't know, Cyprus during Frankish conquest, or just for the periods that each locality belonged to the empire?
Yes. Thank you. I did mention this, perhaps I wasn't clear enough because I did it rather briefly. For the core regions, which are the heart of the map, that is the southern Balkans, Western Asia Minor, the islands, including Cyprus, we include all the data for the whole of the period regardless. So we don't distinguish, for example, the Seljuk or Ottoman periods in Asia Minor or the different periods in political rule in Cyprus. For other areas which are more marginal on the map, we've made some choices. So we've included data from southern Italy just for the period of Byzantine rule. We haven't included the north shore or of the Black Sea at all. So even though there are some data from Crimea which we could have included, we don't. Partly because it would have made the map, would have got sort of lost in the fringes, and partly because the conditions for doing the research are not very easy there. And the same is true to some extent of the northeast, the southeast shore of the Black Sea. So there are some parts where we've been very selective. In eastern Anatolia, we've also been very selective. But Western Anatolia, we've covered really consistently right through. So there, actually, the one element of a certain subjectivity is there in the selection of the areas that we've included. I felt that to take a place that was under Byzantine rule for a very short time, like Crimea or southern Italy, in relation to the whole project, would have been to unbalance it to some extent. But to be honest, then what have I done with Crete? Because there is very, very little information about Jews in Crete under Byzantine rule. In fact, some people have even doubted that there was a Jewish community there. I don't think that's reasonable, but because you find quite an established Jewish community from the very beginning of Venetian rule in the early 13th century. But most of the data actually come from the Venetian period in Crete, but we've included it. So yes, you could say I've been inconsistent, but I've tried to think of the possible interest of people. I mean, clearly in Greece there's a lot of interest in the whole of the area of Greece, and so it seemed reasonable to include everything. And the other reason that prompted me was that the culture of the Jews in Venetian Crete was to a large extent Byzantine. They used Greek as a language, and they in many ways thought of themselves as Byzantines. They had very close connections with Constantinople. They, if you look at their attitude to the Turkish, the Ottoman conquest, for example, they had a very negative attitude to the Ottoman conquest, unlike Jews in some other places. So in many ways, I thought it was perfectly justified culturally as well to include the the Cretan Jews for the whole of the period. But I have been very much determined by the data, because when you've got a project like this which is based on hard data, then it's hard just to dismiss bodies of really strong data. So it's possible that the title of the project is a little bit misleading, but that's the sort of policy we've been. Did you have a particular region you were interested in?
No, I just wanted to know.
No.
I just wanted to know how you work.
Sure.
Well, I would like to thank you very much for giving us a preview of a tool that I'm sure we will want to play with and learn more about. And we have a glass of wine in the lobby, so I'm sure that Nicholas will be happy to entertain further questions. Thank you. Wow, so this will be live in 3 weeks? Or it is live?
The end of March it will be live. No, it's not. It's live.